Congressman Swalwell, consider what we just heard from Rush Limbaugh, who's saying, why should we believe this, people? And he reverse engineers a theory going all the way back to the election of 2000, that the CIA didn't like the election of 2000 and the way it turned out, and they didn't like President Bush. And so they've been working against Republican presidents all along, including tricking Bush into an Iraq war so that he would be embarrassed by it. All of that is predicate to the theory of where we are today and why no one should believe anything in the intelligence community about Donald Trump and about Russia. And that's what you're up against. And that's what you're up against in the thinking of the Republican members of the House Intelligence Committee and the House Judiciary Committee that you serve with every day.
Lawrence, had I known you were going to make me listen to that clip, I probably would have turned down just this one time an invitation to come on the show. But this is how truth works in Trump's Washington, which is you just forget what the truth was the day before. You get your marching orders about what the new lies are that you have to follow, and you're not to ask any questions, even if they completely contradict what you were told you were supposed to believe the day before. That is exactly what we are up against. And my Republican colleagues, they so dearly want to believe that Donald Trump is somebody who he is not. And I think Adam Schiff said it best on the Senate floor during that trial. He said, you will not change him. You cannot constrain him. He is a different animal. He's actually not a Republican. He's blown up the deficit and he's raised taxes on middle-class workers. And so when they want to believe he's Ronald Reagan, he's exactly the opposite. He is acting still as an agent of Russia, and this is exactly what we warned about in the impeachment trial, and he's doing exactly what we feared.
Did the Washington Post breaking news report today about Russian interference to help the Sanders campaign, did that come as news to you members of the House Intelligence Committee?
What I can say is I asked questions of Director Wray during the House Judiciary Committee hearing 2 weeks ago. Plainly, I said, are the Russians still interfering? And he said, yes. And without going into that classified briefing with the Intelligence Committee, Senator Sanders has now confirmed that he was told by the intelligence community that they are seeking to help him. And I think the real question is, Lawrence, not to have the infighting among Democrats as to whether Sanders should have disclosed this sooner. The real question is, when did Donald Trump learn that Russia was seeking to help Sanders? Because for the last few months, he has really ratcheted up a constant, consistent, loud preference for Senator Sanders himself. So if he's taking information from the intelligence community and then feeding it back into his Twitter feed to millions of Americans because he has the same aligned interests as the Russians, that's a real problem.
Well, Bernie Sanders says he learned about it about a month ago. The president certainly was told about it before Bernie Sanders. It's his intelligence services that were discovering this and making this presentation. But let me ask you something, because I really don't have a view of this. I don't know what I would have advised a candidate to do. If a candidate is presented with this information, as Senator Sanders was a month ago, if this was presented to you when you were still a presidential candidate, what would you have done? Would you have made it public?
And my instinct would be to name and shame. But I don't know, Senator Sanders has never served on the Intelligence Committee. I don't know if he thought he was being given information he couldn't say publicly. If he did think that, he probably should have asked if he could share it publicly, because I think you have to continue to name and shame the Russians. But again, I don't want to put this on Senator Sanders. This is about the President of the United States. He should name and shame. If he knew this first, he should be calling out the Russians and disavowing it.
No, I agree with you. I think Bernie Sanders was put in a weird and impossible position, and an unpredictable one as a presidential candidate. And also, no candidate should be in this position because the United States of America has had 4 years to stop this.
Lawrence, that's right. Exactly what we learned from the intelligence community assessment in 2016 still persists today. And that's why Donald Trump should have been removed. That's why we now have to remove him at the ballot box, because he will continue to act on Russia's behalf. And when he said at a rally the other day, why would Vladimir Putin prefer me? It's because he's corrupt. Vladimir Putin doesn't see him as a Ronald Reagan Republican. Vladimir Putin sees him the way he sees himself. He's transactional. He's corrupt. He will continue to put his own interest above ours.
Congressman Eric Swalwell, thank you very much for joining us tonight. And I apologize for the 2 minutes of Rush Limbaugh, but I just thought you should know what's being pumped through the brain of Jim Jordan and the others on the other side of the aisle. Yeah, you need to know that. That's what they're hearing every day. Thank you very much, Congressman. Really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.